right, everyone, welcome to this panel on effective board governance and the upside of board governance for startups. So, joined with Thandi, Mark. What we'll do first is if you guys can just give us an introduction to yourselves. So, who are you, what's your organization, and what's a highlight of the time that you've been there so far? So I think I'll start. My name's Kia. I'm the former chief of staff of La Plage Factory, a startup incubator based in Mauritius. And a great highlight of my time there was really getting to understand the Indian Ocean region, getting to work with startups from all over the region, and also large startups coming in from this continent over there to set up and then start working out into the rest of the continent. So Thandi, if you can go.
Hello, yeah. So I'm Thandi. My background is more of a listed background, actually. I worked in the listed space for a number of years before joining Havaik this year. So overall, I'm relatively new to unlisted space, PE and VC. And the reason I made the switch is I wanted to engage more closely with the individuals behind the numbers and the companies behind the ideas making a difference. And so that's why I made the switch. It's been an interesting journey, dynamic and fluid to say the very least. Havaik, we've been operating for the past 8 years. We're based out of Cape Town and we invest in young tech startups. And we like to say that although we're not impactful investors, we invest in portfolio companies and investees that are making some sort of change to the communities that they serve, be it through safety tech, health tech, business tech, and changes. From a geographical mandate perspective, we invest in South Africa and East and Western Africa, with our split being 70 to 75% South Africa and the remainder in East and West, mainly Kenya and Nigeria. And in future, looking to explore more broadly into other geographical regions throughout Africa. We have 2 funds under management currently. Fund 1 was a small fund, $3 million, and then Fund 2 is a $20 million USD fund, which will be 75% deployed by the end of this quarter. And then, more excitedly, we are currently raising for our 3rd fund, which is a $50 million USD fund. And the mandate from a geographical perspective will remain the same, as well as from the kind of companies that we invest in. And then your last question, Gia, what is the
highlight?
The highlight. I'd definitely say it's recently it has been the offsite that we hosted for our investors and portfolio companies. So our portfolio companies from East and West, as well as South Africa, came to join us for an offsite for 2 days, and we also had an investor evening for Fund 3. And it was really good to meet the people behind these startups that you deal with. It brought to home that you're dealing with more than just numbers. You're dealing with people that are creating employment opportunities, and that also have their personal challenges. And in having that connection with them, you're able to move beyond strategy in a more informative and personal way. And then the investor evening, as well, was great just to see. I mean, a couple of years ago, Havaik said that they struggled to get even 20 people to come to the investor evening. And this past investor evening, we had more than 100, LPs as well as retail investors come through. So to see the growth and where we're going and the ceiling being reached was definitely a highlight.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Mark, please.
Perfect, and always a pleasure to join such esteemed panelists as Kea and Thandi on my right-hand side. I'll try to keep our intro short. So my name is Mark. I've been a former startup founder, a venture builder, and now a venture capitalist for most of my professional career. Right now, I run a firm called Dream VC, which is actually a venture capital institute focused on African markets. What that means is we train individual investors to break into the space. Anybody curious about VC, private equity, or angel investing in African markets, we upskill them so that they can secure job opportunities and actually transition into the market. We also work to upskill various funds, working with close to 100 VC funds across Africa, and we help to support funds in deploying new fund structures. So for a number of corporates across East, West, North, and South Africa, we're now helping to manage or deploy their corporate venture capital funds. So spread across the ecosystem, and looking forward to the discussion today.
All right, great. Thank you guys so much for the intros. So this panel is going to run a little bit differently from previous ones. So audience, at any point in time, please just lift up your hand if you have any sort of questions. Don't be afraid to ask. We're here to help. All right, and then panelists, this will be more of a back and forth discussion, you know. Got some questions laid out, but really we're having a real discussion. We're trying to make it nice and meaty. All right, so first one is just definitions. All right, now I'll start with Mark on this one. So what is a board? How does it function? Why is it important? All right, so Mark, you wrote a report on board governance and effective board governance for startups. So I'd really like to hear your perspective on that. All right, from the 3 pillars of startup, VC, and also customer, because those are the 3 places that a board plays. And then Thandi, you as well, from the VC perspective, what is an effective board? Why is it important? How does it function? So Mark, we'll start with you.
Sure, and maybe it's a nice point to also plug in that actually myself and close to about 15 different funds within the Africa Arena Digital Collective Africa community have been working for the past few months to create a free resource for founders, investors, and various other stakeholders to understand governance dynamics. We've seen several startups and funds fail to meet governance expectations. So to standardize market norms, we've put together a document. It's over 50 pages long and includes a bunch of free templates which you can just plug and play, both for startups at the stage where you're raising your first round, for startups that are a bit more mature, for VC funds in dealing with startups, in setting up advisory boards, boards of directors, and whatnot. So there's going to be a document, and you will, of course, be able to see it on the social media pages of Africa Arena afterwards. It's a free resource. It's meant for your benefit. Now, to your point, boards, what are they? What is an effective board? How do they function, and why are they important? So a board essentially is a new layer of management that's set up within companies, both companies that are starting to reach maturity and, of course, every publicly listed company around the world, which are responsible for ensuring that the company is managed properly, and there are a set of protocols and structures in place for ensuring no impropriety in the company. That stems across a range of different functions. No impropriety in decision-making, no impropriety in the way the company actually interacts with its customers and suppliers, but also in ensuring that the management of a board is run effectively. At a simplified level, a board is usually a group of individuals who are essentially appointed by a company to oversee the day-to-day management. So your classic founder, the CEO, CTO, COO, you're running the day-to-day, but who are you reporting to? Who is keeping you accountable to make sure that you're actually doing what your company is supposed to do? Well, that's what the board is for. And for many investors, because we might invest in 10, 100, 200 companies, we can't always be there to make sure to keep you accountable or focus you on representing shareholder interests. So in place of investors, or sometimes on behalf of investors, you set up this intermediary body, a board, which normally starts with about 3 people and then expands to 5 or 7 for more mature firms, that essentially represents all the different shareholders and makes sure that the company has 1, a set of people to turn to for advice, and 2, a set of people to hold them accountable. Now, I won't dive too deep into how effective boards run, because that could be a discussion for hours and hours. But in essence, one really important thing that I want to give as a takeaway for all the founders in the room and anyone curious about boards is the importance of asymmetry in the board. A board must have an odd number of people, and that's something you have to be thinking about right from the beginning. Why? Because fundamentally, you want the board to influence a decision or to move towards a decision. And if you have 2 people, 4 people, 6 people, there's always the possibility of a split vote. So at any point in the company's formation, you normally are pushing for a board that's an odd number of people, and that's not biased towards either the investor or the founder. So we normally want to have an odd number of people, and to have a number of people who are not affiliated with either the founder or the investor, so-called independents, who join your board to be the actual objective voice in structuring decision-making.
Thank you, Mark. Thandi?
So at Havaic, one thing we like to do, like a lot of VCs like to do the exact same thing, is when you're setting the term sheets and when you're negotiating with the startups, is to insist on them having a board, and again, to Mark's point, a board that comprises an odd number of people, and more importantly to us, in line with the King IV Code on Corporate Governance, which applies more to listed entities, that they be majority, non-executive, and independent. We constantly are having discussions, and what I found since coming into the VC space and private equity space is that there's a lot of discussions around things that are not necessarily working well. And one of those things, for example, it's a constant topic that not much is done about, but a lot is like we in constant discussions about it, is, you know, gearing more funds towards female-led startups, as well as, you know, why are there not a large amount of female-led startups coming through the pipeline, specifically in South Africa and throughout the region. And, you know, we always say that we can't invest in what's not there. And by what's not there, I mean not sufficient amount of it coming through, right, in deal flow and pipeline. We invest post-revenue, and so the reason that we insist on, or not insist, rather negotiate for a board seat when we invest, is because we like to say that we affect changes once we're inside. And one of those changes that we like to affect is, you know, we'll typically have representation on the board that is a female non-executive, you know, help or assist the startups in structuring it so that it is balanced majority non-exec. And again, the reason we do that is because when there's independence and impartiality, and when there's diversity within the board, it assists in bringing a wealth of resources that otherwise would not be there, and different forms of thinking that would not be there within the board. I've seen the exact same thing play out within the VC and investor side of the coin. You know, a lot of VCs and investors, even on the private equity side of things, actually are founded by like-minded individuals from similar backgrounds. And so what happens then is that the funding that they are deploying is deployed to like-minded VCs as well as startups. And that is a functionality of too many people around the room, you know, with similar thinking. The more diversity you have, you know, you mitigate that risk in the sense that you're thinking broader, that you're exposed to larger networks, and, you know, you can then ensure long-term sustainability. So I think from a startup perspective, you know, it shouldn't be complicated from the onset, also because in setting up corporate governance policies and practices and the board overall, you need to balance the cost-benefits ratio of it all. Startups already, they, you know, are dealing with quite a bit in terms of the fundraising, and then just making sure that operationally they are where they are, and that they are growing to the extent that is required in order to continue raising larger funds and get the valuations where the VCs needed. And so the focus has to be operationally. If you're bogged down on what, even on the listed side, with larger corporates, it's a big problem, setting up governance structures and all the red tape around that, you know, you take your eye off the operational requirements. So it has to be simple enough, but yet effective enough in order, you know, for you to affect the changes that you want to see affected, to attract, you know, new investors, you know, as well as to increase your brand marker to the larger investor landscape at a better scale. So for us, that's our focus, you know, majority non-executive, with independence and diversified. And again, you know, diversification, you think to yourself, why the insistence across the board on having, for example, more female representation, having people from diversified backgrounds? Is because they bring different thoughts and processes into play that otherwise would not be thought of if it's just a predominantly male or predominantly specific ethnicity group around the table making all the decisions. So,
Mark, you have something to say?
Yeah, I think maybe just to jump in on this, because I probably can guess that there's a couple of founders in the room who might be very, very early, and they're thinking, oh my God, this sounds like it's going over my head. Boards, what? I have to have a board as well. A deck is just the only thing I have at this point. I also need a board and independence and everything else. Guys, this is why there are VCs in the room. VCs in the room come in to standardize, professionalize, and support you in structuring some of the governance expectations. We do have some expectations coming in, but as an ideation stage business, we don't expect you to come in and immediately have a board. It's something that you have once you reach a certain point of maturity. And exactly as Thandiwe mentioned, it sometimes is almost too early to have a board. So sometimes I do see businesses that are structured by former corporate execs where you have, you know, a 7-person board and you don't even have a product yet. There's no reason for you to have a board when you're at that early of a stage. Unless you really need the additional advice, quite often the board really starts to help you when you are starting to scale your business and you want to tap into their expertise and you have external shareholders to be responsible for. So actually in that same document that Kea alluded to earlier, we actually have a transitionary guidance, often starting with perhaps just having some informal mentors to help you understand areas you don't know, then advancing to having an advisory board, which is when you have some individuals who help you in an unstructured basis, and only later maturing to have a board of directors, where of course then you need to structure it properly, and VCs can help to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Tandi. So my next question is, you both alluded to this a little bit, but setting up a board. Tandi, you mentioned a lot, setting up a diverse board and those sorts of things. How does that function? How does one practically set up a good board for success for their shareholders and for the company? So we'll actually come with you, Tandi.
I mean, it's a good question. Like I said, we've seen it play out, you know, in the news and throughout, even for listed companies and larger corporates, they get it wrong. And again, you know, they get it wrong because they're trying to, even if the board is sufficiently skilled, that's just one side of the coin. You know, the board does have to be sufficiently skilled because you require, you know, the necessary skills in order to make informed decisions. But more importantly, outside of the skill, you know, it has to be, independence has to be the number one marker. And for independence to be the number one marker, it quite often means that you're not necessarily that familiar with, you know, the people that initially you're surrounding yourself with within the board. And that is why one of the things that we also do quite often, I say this all the time, is that we co-invest when we look at startups. We don't like to go in on our own. So we want to come in with another VC, you know, or PE or another institution. And the reason we do that is not necessarily, one, obviously it is, you know, to mitigate, you know, just putting in the pot alone. But more importantly, it's to have different thoughts around the table, you know, when we're dealing with a VC. If we think the opportunity is, you know, phenomenal for whatever reason, and we think that it's able to, you know, scale in this direction using these resources, having another company come in with a different set of thought processes as well as resources assists in expanding, you know, what would otherwise not be expandable. And so when we do that, they come in with their own resources in terms of knowing people that are skilled as well as that could play the non-executive role, and so they will nominate people to the board. You know, we will nominate people to the board, and typically what VCs do is that it will be someone within the investment team, you know, that takes that non-executive role, and then you recommend people from, like, you know, different resources and backgrounds. I mean, at Hawaii, we all have quite large commercially sound backgrounds in the sense that the founding manager is ex-R&B, you know, like I'm from 91, you know, CA, Kiara, like one of our principals as well, Grant, Eminelo. So we have a wealth of resources from a people perspective, you know, that we know that are sufficiently skilled, and so we'll recommend those people. But of course, as well, the startups need to have a say in terms of what they believe they should be surrounded with around the table. And so they'll quite often nominate names and put names forward of people that they think that should be on the board. And, you know, from an executive perspective, that will often be the founder, you know, as well as a CFO, CEO, CTO. But what's important to guide startups with and assist them with is steering away from having too much of a balance of executive, because then again, what you're having is not an independent board overall, and the decisions then are swayed in one direction, which isn't necessarily balanced and for the interest of the investors overall. So to answer your question simply, I think it's to surround yourself with investors as well as individuals from diversified backgrounds to begin with coming in onto the cap table, because when you do that, then you know, you're expanding your resources in terms of the people that they can recommend to go onto the board. And to Mark's earlier point about, you know, it's not necessarily if you haven't gotten to a revenue stage to have a board and, you know, to you know, set up a board, because again, the cost benefit analysis of it doesn't really play out well. Whilst it's not necessary, it is important to start thinking along those lines, because it attracts investors and you want to raise, you know, more and more as you go along. And in order to do so, one of the, you know, things that works quite well is having a sound board, you know, with the diversified background that's majority independent. That does well in terms of, you know, easing investor sentiment that risk is mitigated sufficiently. And as you continue to raise and scale and grow, you know, you'll be able to, you know, get the exit that you want and the returns that ultimately you want, which is, at the end of the day, as much as the people are great and, you know, portfolio companies inspiring, they're nothing if we don't hit the bottom line. That's just, you know, the reality of it all.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Mark, please.
I guess I'll take a slightly different stab at the question. I do agree with everything Tandiwe said, but I guess I'll just approach it slightly differently in the sense of how do I structure that if I was a founder and I was listening to this as like a step-by-step guide. So as Tandiwe mentioned, number one, you need to think about why do I need a board? Okay, I need a board to run my business well, to leverage their resources for advice, to have someone to hold me accountable, and because investors will expect this to be the standard going forward. So it's good business practice. I don't just need it because investors insist on having one. Okay, so now that you've mentally passed that checkpoint, what are you then doing? You're then thinking, who would I have on my board? So if you know that fundamentally you're probably starting with a small board, let's say 3 people, 5 people, 7 people, who should be there? Well, probably you as the CEO. If you have a co-founder who is also a decision maker, they likely want to be on there as well. Who then would you bring in? Well, likely future investors will want a seat for themselves. So you'd want to have some number of, as we refer to them, independents, individuals who are not working for your firm. And independent doesn't mean your brother or your sister. They're not independent. You might think they are, but realistically they're not. It's someone who has no financial commitment to the startup, which means that if there is a tough decision, the founder and independent board member might fundamentally disagree on where the business should go. The independent should not be tied down to the startup. If that is the case, you have an independent board members, you have then the founders and the core people on the management team on the board, then think about the complementarity of those skill sets. For example, when you're creating a board seat, let's imagine I was a technical guy. I had a great engineering background, and then my co-founder was a fantastic business manager with a good ability to manage people. Well then, maybe neither of us actually have a good reputation in this space. So if we're dealing with selling to big clients, I'd want to have someone on the board who actually has that expertise, who can guide us in how we should structure the business or structure our sales proposition or be positioning us. Maybe someone from a corporate background to complement the lack of skill set that we have on this. I'd probably want somebody maybe from a public policy background to tell us how we are positioning ourselves to the outside world so that we're not making mistakes in our own bubble. So having that, I think that potentially is what Tandiwe was speaking to around this complementarity of backgrounds. It's not just necessarily the function, but it's also like what people have done. And that's why VCs, when they come into a board, if they see that a board looks very monotone, they're all men, or they're all from a very similar background, or they're all former corporate execs in logistics. Even if you're in a logistics business, having 3 people with the same background might not actually add that much value. Maybe you'd want to replace someone with a slightly different background, from a successful startup, from a successful corporate, from an international business, from another fund, who might be able to come in, add that independent thought, and kind of balance out the thought. What I've experienced in my own investment experience in the past is quite often the best independents are the ones who disagree both with the investment shareholders and disagree with the founders. Because it's inevitable that on some things, you as an investor will disagree with the founders, and that's fine, that's healthy. If you agree on everything, something's wrong, you're in a cult. You'll eventually disagree on something, and that's where the independent comes in and helps to kind of moderate and arbitrate that discussion towards one direction or the other. That's why we need independence in the first case.
Great. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about conflict, because in the news recently we had OpenAI, where the board was basically made up of a bunch of non-profit people, or people that were they were very separated from the investors, right? Because that was the non-profit, and then under the non-profit was the for-profit arm, which had massive investment from companies like Microsoft and that. And so there was no, at least from as far as I can tell, there was no line between the investors and shareholders and the board. So how do we deal with that sort of conflict? Because it's very often that when a CEO has to meet the board, because the board is there to hold the CEO accountable, they kind of get shivers and get a little upset that they have to meet with these people. How do we deal with that sort of conflict? And if you guys can even provide your own thoughts on what happened with OpenAI, maybe giving a little bit of context if you have, and then how that can play a role in teaching us as founders and as VCs on how we can better do things in the future. Thandi, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll let Mark run a little bit with, what happened with OpenAI. But on the conflict side, I think, in the example that you just made now as well, the CEO shivering, for example, when he's approaching the board or has to interact with the board. As much as a board, obviously, this point has been reiterated to death now, has to be majority independent and non-executive. It's also very important to empower executive on the board as well. If the executive is not on the board, they don't buy into the strategy. And if they're not buying into the strategy, then they're not buying into the long-term sustainability of the company overall. And so conflict, to Mark's earlier point, is healthy, across the board, because it brings in different views, and it forces one to expand their mind to thinking that they otherwise would not, think about. And if you don't have that and everyone is a yes man around the table, that's a sure signal, that we are not necessarily thinking of all the risks that we need to think about in order to mitigate and, ensure that it's sustainable into the future. So I think the CEO, the CFO, and any other not non-executive, any other executive that's placed on the board needs to have an open door relationship with the board members. And the one way to do that is to include them in, not just strategy input, but to actually include them in strategy implementation. If the board is dictating to the executive management who are hands-on in dealing with the problems on the ground for a company, and there's no buy-in from the executive, it's not going to be successful, not for the long term anyways. So one way to to deal with conflict and have healthy conflict, because there is a difference between healthy conflict and unhealthy conflict, and there's only room for healthy conflicts, in my opinion, and a corporate.
Tell us, what's the difference in this context, difference between healthy and unhealthy, if you can even provide examples to really paint the picture for us?
I think unhealthy conflict is often a product of lack of communication. And lack of communication often comes in when you are not necessarily aligned, just from an ideal and goals perspective. And if you're not aligned from an ideals and goal perspective, what often happens is that you don't necessarily want to engage and communicate with people that aren't on the same page as you. And so you avoid that communication. With one of our startups, we came in, and the founding CEO had, a great background and was very well placed to run this company, in our opinion, when we invested, in the direction that we saw it going for, the IRRs that we target. But what happened, and the board was already set up when we came in, and it compromised of him and the CFO, and 3 other board members, which, they had elected, and then we had an observer seat at that stage, having invested a convertible note. And the CEO made decisions that weren't in the best interest of investors, not in the best interest of the employees, as well as the long-term sustainability of the company. And they were able to do so because they were surrounded by yes men and women, and that's exactly what I mean by lack of communication and the danger that comes in. Because instead of having conversations around why certain decisions are being made, and there's no formal structures in place to sign off resolutions and to sign off decisions, he was able to make those decisions independent of the board, non-executive included. So it's unhealthy conflict, like I've said, when there's lack of communication and there isn't alignment overall. Healthy conflict is one where you sit around the table. I mean, even with us, and like I said, because this is a problem as well on the VC as well as the investor side. If you're surrounded by people from a similar background as you, when you are debating different investment potentials and opportunities, you guys are quite often agreeing. If you all went to the same high school, same varsity, have the same background culturally from a family perspective, you're exposed to the exact same things. And so when an opportunity is presented to you, if it's yes for one, it's likely yes for all. But if it's yes for all, you have to sit back and think, are we actually looking at all the risks and differences that are on the table here objectively? And most likely the answer is no. If there's healthy debate, and back and forth communication, because it's okay to disagree, what that then means is that overall around the table, there's different thoughts that are coming into play, and there's different considerations that are being considered, and then you can go back to the drawing board and sit and say, okay, which of these risks can we mitigate and which can't we, and make a decision together post that discussion. So healthy conflict is a definite, it's important to have. But I also just think from a conflict resolution perspective, a point made by Sango Capital not so long ago was that what's happening in the VC space a little bit is that the investors are playing too much of an active role in the actual startups that extends beyond strategic inputs. You're not meant to be involved operationally. You're not meant to be involved, with the actual groundwork, for lack of a better term. Yours is to have strategic oversight, and in having strategic oversight, if there are conflicts that are arising that you're aware of, even at an executive, lower and senior manager point of view, your input and influence should be sufficient enough to come through at your non-executive level. If it's not, then you haven't set up your structure sufficiently to begin with, and then one then needs to step back again and say, okay, how could we have better constituted this board, and the structures at place in order to ensure that conflict resolution is dealt with without necessarily our influence and input operationally on the ground. Yeah.
Thank you, Thandi. Mark, please.
For the OpenAI case?
Yes.
It's been somewhat over-discussed, so I'll very briefly touch on it. But before I do, I was just thinking, as Thandiwe was commenting, and I was thinking back to before I worked in the startup space, how boards are structured. And I remember thinking initially, when from outside point of view, I was thinking, this is so boring. Why would I ever want to care about boards? Now, obviously, it's kind of part of our day-to-day, but I was thinking it's so complicated, so hard to understand. And I was thinking, how can we make it a little bit easier for some of the audience to kind of relate to what we're doing? Just a quick question for the crowd, just to check who's actually asleep or not. How many of you have watched a TV series or a Netflix show in the last 2 weeks? Can I get a show of hands? Just one? Really? I don't believe that. Okay, let's see. Now it's a bit more real. Okay. How many people in the room have ever heard of a show called Super Pumped? Anyone? 1, 2, 3? Okay. If you haven't, please after the session go and search it up. Super Pumped is a drama. It's not fully real, but it's based on the story of Uber, which is another company which experienced some interesting dynamics with board evolution. It's one of the only shows I've actually seen that dramatizes and actually makes it easy to digest what happened in the startup where the founder and the board were categorically opposed on the different sides. Uber as a startup evolved, eventually raising several rounds of venture capital financing. It had both independents come in, individuals representing the actual company, and individuals representing the VCs and PE funds that had backed Uber. And it eventually came to a crisis point because the founder ultimately was not coachable. The founder was not willing to cooperate with the board, and it was actually an extreme case because it ended up with the board actually replacing the founder for the survival of the business. Uber is still around, Uber is doing very well, so clearly in the long term that might have been the right decision. But at the time, it was highly, highly controversial. So for any of you who are looking to kind of, I guess, contextualize in a sit-at-home, chill context of what we're talking about, watch Super Pumped, think back to what we say, and it will all make a lot more sense. Now coming back to OpenAI. OpenAI is a little bit of a different story. Uber is a fast growth business, venture backable, that scaled, that experienced issues with management, board, and investor interests coming at loggerheads. OpenAI is a little bit different because OpenAI started as a not-for-profit. The vast majority of you, anyone who's a founder in the crowd, are probably not-for-profits. You're building a business that is intended to scale. Either you're building an SME that is meant to be profitable from day one, or you're building a startup that is growing to reach profitability down the line. With that in mind, your goals are quite different from a not-for-profit, which is often building for societal impact. And that's what OpenAI was initially. It was a foundation. As a result, the foundation was structured in such a way where there wasn't intended to be any space for external contributors to the board, external contributors appointed by investors. So what you ended up with was a relatively complex structure of a company, not just a holding company for the purpose of receiving investments and then the actual management company, but several independent entities, where actually the entity that was controlling the day-to-day operations of OpenAI, the entity with direct involvement of Sam Altman, the CEO, and direct involvement of the investment shareholders such as Microsoft, was not actually the executive board overseeing the foundation. And where that came to crisis was that earlier this year, the board overseeing the foundation itself didn't believe that the path towards mass commercialization of data that OpenAI was driving towards was consistent with the actual objectives of the foundation. So the board took the decision at the time to essentially recommend for the dismissal of Sam Altman as the CEO, which then, of course, ran against investor interests. So running back to Kaya's point, what can we learn from this? Well, number one, don't start a foundation if you're running a for-profit business. A non-profit and a for-profit are completely different entities, different parts of the economy, and they both have their own role. Number two, don't conflict the foundation board or the non-profit board with the operation of the for-profit shareholding entity. And number three, if you do go through the transition of going from a social enterprise or perhaps a non-for-profit towards a for-profit, you need to, in advance, also think of the necessary changes in governance and the management of the company, which OpenAI didn't really go through. It didn't go through that transition. It didn't go through the process of setting up a new board informed by the new strategic direction that the business took as soon as it led to or moved to commercialize generative AI models. So I think it was more so a problem of several years ago finally materializing in this year rather than something that happened just specifically this year, as perhaps some of us might think. And hopefully that leads to one or two takeaways.
Thank you very much, Mark. So before we carry on, any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Come up.
Can we get a microphone to someone in the crowd?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Sara Medina from Portugal, from SPI. Can you hear?
Can you just speak up a little bit?
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. So my question, really congratulations on the panel, really excellent views. My question is about reporting. When the VC takes a management role in the board, does the reporting dramatically increases? Because I heard cases that it becomes very, very demanding for the startup or for the SME in terms of reporting that needs to provide when the VC takes a management role in the board. Thank you.
All right, reporting.
I'll take reporting, being an accountant, by background. I understand the frustrations to a certain extent, like I've said, for the startups, with more and more red tape added as they get institutional investors in particular on the board. It seems like more and more onerous requirements are required of the startups, that steer them a little bit away from the focus of operations and, actually doing the work that they, sought out to do. The reality of the situation, and I say this all the time, going back to the bottom line, is that as VCs, and any other investors, I think, I won't necessarily speak for angels, but I'll speak for institutional investors in particular. You're investing not necessarily because, you're a charity and out of the goodness of your heart. The reality is that you're running a business, right? And you've got, investors that you've got to report back to. It's returns that are being made for these people that have given you their money, and they require certain outcomes. One of the ways in which to manage, risk of an investment, for example, going to zero, or not tracking, from a target perspective where you foresee it going, from a 5-year, 7-year, 8-year horizon, whatever the horizon is for the particular, VC making the investment, is through reporting. There's a reason why the mechanism is, there in place. I think, though, a different approach needs to be taken for different stages of where a VC is. Typically when not a VC, sorry, portfolio company is. Typically when we invest, we do say that, for example, we do quarterly reporting, as well as, annual reporting, and our, annual reports are audited by auditors. And we have it as a requirement, that when we invest, we expect monthly management accounts, as well as quarterly management accounts, and then, of course, like annual. And it's a struggle. I've seen it. It's a struggle to, get that reporting, from the startups, because again, they're busy with the actual work that they, sought out to do. But again, what one needs to realize is that, the interests of all parties, are at play here. And whilst it may seem like an, onerous red tape, additional requirements, for startups, it's actually protecting the sustainability of their vision and company overall. If you're not producing reports, it's difficult for you to see actually whether or not you're meeting the bottom line, whether or not from a headcount and a resource point of view, have we hired too much personnel? Are we leveraging too much? Is our debt highly geared? Do we need to, structure it a little bit down so we've got a better balance between debt and equity? And you can't often do that and have that kind of insight unless you're producing reports. So there has to be a balance in terms of, the kind of reporting, from a magnitude perspective you require from different VCs, for sure. From different portfolio companies, for sure. I agree with that. But the requirement of reporting overall cannot be taken away. It's important. And again, the whole objective, right, for us anyways, when we invest in these portfolio companies, we invest in believing in what the overall vision is and invest in believing that, they can scale locally, and for us it's, globally as well. And in order to, actualize that, to get to the 30% IRRs, to eventually exit, to potentially list in future one day, if that is, what is required from both parties, you have to start putting in place the mechanisms that will get you there, because investors will insist on reporting going forward, and so the sooner you start it and getting the kind of reports and the structures that are required in place, the better really. Rather than, for example, only getting your report mechanisms in place when you get to a Series C, and then at Series C haven't recognized that actually we are highly geared, and we didn't recognize that our debt levels were growing to such an extent, or actually we're not geared enough, and there is more room and scope, to have debts instead of just raising equity. So reporting is important, but I think the magnitude at which the reporting is required can definitely be altered from one portfolio company to another and one startup to another.
Thank you so much, Thandiwe, and also thank you very much to our panel. It's been absolutely fantastic having you this morning, and I think we've learned so much from the conversation that was had. The upside of board governance, VC to startup. I think a lot of the times we think of ourselves as this superhero spaza shop that's going to do everything all by ourselves, and we are so in it to win it a lot of the time that we don't actually see what's happening around us. So being able to have people that we can be accountable to, and that sometimes do think differently, because this is something that also came up. And let's not be scared to have people who do think differently and challenge us, and our goals and our vision while we are, continuing with our startups as well. So it's not as scary. I mean, when I saw this title, I thought, ooh, because many startups kind of like the idea of being small and cozy, and this idea of a board, suits, and all sorts of things can seem really intimidating. But sometimes you need that little bit of help and assistance. So thank you so much for that. Great panel discussion for this morning. Thank you. That was Thandiwe Maqethua and also Mr. Tlo. Thank you so much for handling the conversation, and Mark Kleiner for coming in. Thank you.